Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. The UFC has recently announced a bunch of fights, and in a couple particular cases, it's left fans scratching their heads. How did this fight get put together? And there's 3 fights we're going to talk about in this video. 2 of them, in each of those fights, you have one top 10 ranked contender fighting an unranked guy who only has 1 fight in the UFC in both of those cases. Then you have a third fight that is not official yet. It is being reported as being targeted by the UFC, where you have a top 5 ranked UFC fighter fighting somebody who's not even in the top 10 of the rankings. And in all 3 of these cases, the fighter who is either unranked or low ranked is a Dagestani fighter. And this has a lot of people speculating, is the UFC showing favoritism towards the Dagestani fighters and gifting them, top ranked matchups? And I started to think about it. This is a perfect video idea. And the more I started to think about it, I think there is a case to be made that is going to blow your mind, that there is a clear bias by the UFC towards Dagestani fighters. And we're going to look at all 3 of these matchups. We're going to talk about all 3 of these matchups in depth. We're going to talk about the rankings and who makes the rankings. And we're also going to talk about something else I noticed, and I mentioned this in my UFC 291 video. I'll link that down in the description, that nobody's talking about. I came to a conclusion in regards to 2 of these matchups that absolutely nobody has mentioned. So we're going to talk about that in this video as well. So what are the fights that are happening? Well, the first matchup that was announced, it was announced about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It is the main event of a UFC fight night on July 1st. We have Sean Strickland versus Abus Magomedov. And in this particular fight, you have Sean Strickland, who's number 7 ranked in the division. He's coming off a win over Nasruddin Imavov. He's fighting unranked Abus Magomedov, who has 1 fight in the UFC. He fought Dustin Stolfus. So you really start to think about it, well, how the heck did that happen? Because Sean Strickland is in the top 10, and in this case, you have a guy who's unranked, only 1 fight in the UFC, and now he's getting a jump up in the top 10 of the middleweight division. And, full disclosure, I like all these fights regardless of what the rankings are, and we're going to get to this later in the video. But, people are wondering, like, how is this happening? Aren't the rankings there so the UFC can use those as kind of a guide for matchmaking? Isn't the number 1 contender supposed to fight for the title, which isn't always true, but that's a topic for a whole nother video. But you have a case here where you have Sean Strickland, number 7, fighting an unranked guy with 1 fight in the UFC. I like this fight a lot. I always love fights where you're kind of throwing a guy to the wolves and testing him. And I think that's kind of this fight here. Abus Magomedov, we don't know how good he is. He has 1 fight against Dustin Stolfus where he finished him early. We don't really know his skill set, and we definitely don't know because he hasn't been tested against anybody of any high skill set. So we're getting that against Sean Strickland. I like it, but I do understand people's gripes. What is the next fight that was announced? This is another middleweight fight, and this was announced yesterday for UFC 291, late July. We are getting Paulo Costa versus Ikram Aliskerov. That is craziness. Ikram just defeated Phil Hawes at UFC 288, first round KO. That was his UFC debut. He came off of Dana White's Contender Series, and he beat Phil Hawes, who's arguably on his way out the door. And then you have Paulo Costa, who hasn't fought since August of 2022. He defeated Luke Rockhold. This was at UFC 278, the same fight card where Kamaru Usman got flatlined in the 5th round by Leon Edwards. But before that, he had 2 losses, 1 to Marvin Vettori, 1 to Israel Adesanya when he fought for the title. So we're talking within 2 fights, Paulo Costa goes from fighting for the belt to fighting an unranked contender with 1 fight in the UFC. That is craziness. And then the third fight. What is the third fight? This is the fight that is reported to being targeted by the UFC. And this is probably my favorite of the 3 matchups. You have Cory Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov. You have Sandhagen, who's ranked number 4 in the bantamweight division, taking on Umar, who is ranked number 11 in the bantamweight division. That is a massive jump up. And you look at Cory Sandhagen, he's on a 2-fight win streak. Had he not had a dominant loss to Aljamain Sterling back in 2020, he'd be right in title discussion. And he called out Merab Dvalishvili. Everyone seems to be calling out Merab nowadays. Henry Cejudo called out Merab. Merab apparently had surgery on his hand, so he's not going to be fighting anytime soon. And now Cory Sandhagen, the number 4 guy, is all of a sudden, well, the UFC's telling him, you got to take a step back. You got to fight the number 11 ranked guy in Umar Nurmagomedov. And I think if you look at these fights on their surface level, you're like, well, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why are these fighters getting such big step up in competition, especially when you look at the Ikram fight, fighting Paulo Costa, and you look at the Abus fight, fighting Sean Strickland, because those guys only have one fight in the UFC. At least if you look at Umar Nurmagomedov, he has 4 fights in the UFC. At least you can kind of start to justify it. But I really do believe there is something going on here. And I think a lot of people are going to miss what is going on specifically with these 2 middleweight fights. And I do believe what is going on here is the UFC is looking towards the future of the division. And you look at the future of the division, you have Israel Adesanya as the champion. Alex Pereira moved up after he got flatlined at UFC 287. And you start looking at the middleweight division, and there's really not a whole lot of hope in terms of contenders for Israel Adesanya. It was a year and a half ago. They were like, oh, Nasruddin Imavov's making his way up. Andre Muniz is making his way up. Muniz lost to Brendan Allen. Imavov just lost to Strickland. So then you start looking at the division right now. Robert Whittaker, he's already fought twice. Martin Vettori's already fought twice. Jarrett Cannonier, he already defeated, and Jarrett Cannonier's getting up there in age. Paulo Costa, he already fought. Dricus du Plessis is kind of the guy, that people are speculating might happen by the end of the year, but guess what? The UFC just booked him against Robert Whittaker. He's not getting by Robert Whittaker unless Robert Whittaker slips on a banana peel in the cage. It's just not happening. So I guess Robert Whittaker's getting the next title shot if he beats Dricus, unless Adesanya is moving up and attempting to become double champion and maybe fight Jamal Hill, which is always possible. But then you start to get down, okay, you have Sean Strickland, which if Sean Strickland wins another fight, depending on where the division is at, Sean Strickland can fight for the belt. He's fighting Abus Magomedov. So what I really think is going on here is you have the UFC kind of planning out the future for the middleweight division in terms of hoping to build up some fresh contenders for Israel Adesanya, because nobody wants to see these rematches and trilogies of fights where Adesanya's already beaten them, mainly twice. In Marvin Vettori's case, Robert Whittaker's case, he already beat him twice. If he fights him a third time this year, is anyone going to want a Robert Whittaker 4th fight? Highly doubtful. So I think what the UFC is hoping for in both the Paulo Costa versus Ikram Aliskerov matchup, Paulo Costa, while that would still be a rematch, it's been 3 years since that. So if Paulo Costa goes out there and, exposes Ikram or TKOs Ikram in the first round, because these are huge step up in competition for Ikram, he's right back in title contention. If Ikram goes out there and starches Paulo Costa, he's right in title discussion because he just beat a top 5 guy. And the same thing for Sean Strickland and Abus Magomedov. In that case, whoever wins that fight is going to be close to title contention just by process of elimination. So I really think both of these matchups were made because the UFC wants to build up the middleweight division. But I do understand some people's point of, oh, is the UFC really just being biased and giving Dagestani fighters, top fights because they want them to succeed? They're pushing them and showing favoritism towards them. And I'm going to get to that in a second. But you have a system in the rankings, and this is a topic for a whole other video as well, but I wanted to talk about it here, where I understand people are saying you have an unranked contender fighting a top 10 ranked guy. In my opinion, and I've said this time and time again, I believe the rankings are meaningless. If you look up on the UFC's website, UFC rankings, how are the rankings determined? I'll put a screenshot on the screen. Rankings were generated by a voting panel made up of media members. The media members were asked to vote on who they feel are the top fighters in the UFC by weight class and pound for pound. A fighter is only eligible to be voted on if they are active status in the UFC, so on and so forth. You go down, it says the rankings panel is comprised of media members from the following outlets. And you got KHON Honolulu, MMA Odds Breaker, CFMU 93.3. I'm not going to read them all. I don't know who any of these people are. So essentially, the way the rankings are being compiled are by a bunch of no-name strangers. We have no idea. So in my opinion, the rankings cause more problems than they're worth. I think the rankings are an excuse for usually top-ranked guys to turn down fights against up-and-coming guys. When I first started watching the UFC, there was no rankings. There was no, oh, I'm not fighting that guy. He's behind me in the rankings. It was just whatever fights got made, got made. But I do understand that some of these matchups, okay, well, why didn't we get Paulo Costa versus Khamzat Chimaev? I do understand that. I do understand, okay, well, you could have done Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis and had a new middleweight contender out of that as well. So I do think there is a bit of truth to the UFC saying, you know what? We're going to push some of these guys, these up-and-coming Dagestani guys who have shown in the past, just from the fighters from that region, have an ability to be very successful in the UFC. And I think the UFC is like, okay, well, they looked good in their debuts. Both of them got first-round KOs. Let's throw them to the wolves. And where I want to get into the point where you can see you can make a definitive case for bias towards the Dagestani fighters and towards a favoritism for the UFC, I believe that's not true. Not in these three cases, because even in the Cory Sandhagen Umar Nurmagomedov fight, you look at that matchup, Umar, he's jumping up quite a few spots, and people constantly say, and I've heard other people say this, oh, Umar's jumping the line. But Umar Nurmagomedov, it has been known he wanted to fight in March. It's now almost June. He still doesn't have a fight. And the UFC has said nobody wants to fight Umar Nurmagomedov. People ahead of him are turning him down. So how is he supposed to fight up the rankings if people are turning him down? And I honestly believe people saying Umar cut the line. No, I don't believe Umar's cutting the line. I believe the fighters in the division are letting Umar in front of him. Because if you're refusing to fight him, then you're forfeiting your spot. Unless you have an injury, you are forfeiting your spot in the division. And right now, Cory Sandhagen's not getting a title shot. He's not fighting Aljamain Sterling. He just lost to him. I know it was a couple years ago, but he got dominated. He's not getting a title shot off a 2-fight win streak. O'Malley's already getting the title shot. So why not have him fight Umar? We need somebody to test him. I wanted Umar versus Merab. And that's even crazier because you have Merab at number 1. And I just think the rankings are an excuse. But I do think there is a level of bias that you can expose here. But it's not favoritism. And this is an argument, it's not a hill I would die on. But for everyone saying, oh, there's favoritism towards the Dagestani fighters. And again, maybe in some cases, maybe in some examples where you can say, okay, the UFC is really pushing them. And I also do think there's a hint of truth there in the UFC's thought process. But I believe there's so many other factors you can't really say. You can't put the sole blame on that here. If anything, I think you can make a better case, a stronger argument of anti-Dagestani bias for the UFC. Because they're getting thrown to the wolves. Ikram Aliskerov getting thrown to Paulo Costa. Abus Magomedov getting thrown to Sean Strickland. Umar Nurmagomedov getting thrown to Cory Sandhagen. All tough matchups. Every single one of them may lose. And you're going to say, well, how is that anti-Dagestani bias? Well, I brought up a couple examples. First off, Bo Nickal. Bo Nickal is fighting Tresean Gore in his next fight. It's a fairly winnable matchup. It's a fun matchup. There's a little bit of threat from Tresean Gore, but most people are going to expect Bo Nickal to go out there, take him down, and finish him. And what was his UFC debut? It was against Jamie Pickett. Basically an easy win for him. And Bo Nickal, even on Dana White's Contender Series, he fought nothing but grocery store cashiers. So why isn't Bo Nickal getting a big jump up? Khamzat said he would fight him. Bo Nickal's calling out Khamzat. Never going to happen. Because you know what? The UFC is playing favoritism, giving him easier matchups, and I think this will go on for another at least 3 fights. And case in point, let's move over to Paddy Pimblett. Paddy Pimblett is a direct comparison to Umar Nurmagomedov. They're both in stacked divisions. They both have 4 fights in the UFC. Who has Paddy Pimblett fought? Luigi Rengermini, I don't even believe he's in the UFC anymore. Rodrigo Vargas, don't believe he's in the UFC anymore. Jordan Levitt, he's still in the UFC, but again, another easier matchup, a matchup that most people expect him to win. And then Jarrett Gordon, who most people expect him to win that fight. He lost the fight, but he won via brutal robbery. So you have all these Dagestani guys getting thrown to the wolves immediately. But meanwhile, you have Bo Nickal, you have Paddy Pimblett, all being babied. And also, you have Sean O'Malley. And this case isn't as strong anymore. But at one point in time, a year ago, this case was stronger than ever. There is no wins on Sean O'Malley's resume outside of Petr Yan, who is still on the UFC roster. That is insane to me. He's been in the UFC all the way since 2017. The matchups that he's gotten have been nothing but favorable matchups. He lost to Marlon Vera. He's the only guy that's still in the UFC outside of Petr Yan. His most recent wins, Thomas Almeida, Chris Montino, Raulian Paiva. When were we going to toss Sean O'Malley to the wolves? It took him far more fights to get tossed to Petr Yan before it actually happened. And also, I do believe in terms of the favoritism argument towards the Dagestanis, you can make the same case. Well, now you have cases where there's certain fighters who aren't ranked. You know, Sean O'Malley took a bunch of fights, but he fought no-name competition. Now all of a sudden he's fighting the number one contender. At the time in the rankings, O'Malley was like number 13 or 14 when he fought Petr Yan. So a similar scenario there, but much more fights underneath that. Much longer tenure in the UFC. And Paddy Pimblett, I mean, imagine comparing him to Umar Nurmagomedov. Think about how crazy that comparison is. They're both roughly the same age. Paddy Pimblett's a couple years older. He's a year and a half older. So Paddy Pimblett's a little bit older than Umar. Nobody thinks of Paddy Pimblett the same way they think of Umar. Nobody thinks of that. So I really do. I'm not really dying on either one of these hills. But I'm just saying, if you want to say, oh, well, these matchups are made out of favoritism towards them, I think you can make the same argument to say, oh, well, this is anti-Dagestani because they're getting tossed to the wolves. Meanwhile, you have other fighters, Bo Nickel, Paddy Pimblett, Sean O'Malley, who are getting much longer times in the UFC, much more fights in the UFC against lesser competition before they get that jump up in competition. And 2 out of the 3 examples I gave you haven't even got that jump up in competition yet. So I really think it's an argument that you could make, but I just don't think in these particular cases, I don't think that argument holds any water. I think the UFC is trying to recalibrate the middleweight division and trying to get more contenders for Israel Adesanya. I don't believe the UFC's actually saying, oh, we hate the Dagestani, so we're giving them top-level competition. I'm just saying that you could make that case if you wanted to. You could make that case, even though I'm not saying that's what happened. I believe what it shows is the UFC has seen the progress some of the Dagestanis had made in the UFC, and they're like, okay, well, they look good in their debuts. Let's throw them right to the wolves. You had matchups, Khamzat Chimaev, Leon Edwards. It never happened. Very similar scenario to both of those, or all 3 of these fights, really. Very similar scenario. And the Sean O'Malley versus Petr Yan is kind of similar, but not really because O'Malley had so many fights beforehand. But just in terms of the rankings jumping up from outside, basically, you know, barely top 15 to the number 1 contender, similar situation there, but just had a lot more fights in the UFC before that happened. But let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.